Hello, my name is Gilberto Vera, and I'm Director of the Housing Justice Collaborative at Legal Aid Society San Diego. The presentation today will be on the Emergency Housing Choice Voucher Program, also known as EHV, learning what San Diego tenants and landlords need to know. First, an introduction to the EHV program. So some background, the Emergency Housing Choice Voucher Program was originally is a program that provides rental assistance to vulnerable population facing housing instability. Um, Very similar to Section 8 Housing Choice Vouchers. They're administered very similarly, except that these EHV vouchers were specifically allocated during the COVID pandemic to vulnerable populations such as domestic violence survivors, chronically homeless, and other housing insecure individuals or households. Um, these programs are administered locally by public housing authorities. For example, the San Diego Housing Commission administers a program for all EHV households in the city of San Diego. Um, and regarding the EHV funding and timeline, so originally the funding allocated by the federal government to this EHV program, which is nationwide, was expected to last through 2030. However, due to higher than projected increases in rent, the program funding is projected to end in fall 2026, about 6 years into the projected 10-year period. As a result, this has prompted public housing authorities to start creating contingency plans and communicating with tenants and landlords regarding the plans to wind down the program. Also, the purpose of this video today is to help these public housing authorities get this information out there to both landlord and tenants. And just in general, it's important to be aware of the eligibility, the program structure, and timelines. That way we can help tenants and landlords make informed housing decisions. Next, we're going to talk about the projected funding cliff and associated risks. Like I mentioned, the EHV program is expected to run out of funding sometime in fall 2026. Risking assistance lost for many households. There's about 700 total households with EHV vouchers in San Diego County across the 6 different public housing authorities that we have in San Diego County. And it's the impact that it's going to have on tenants and landlords is rent increases and funding cuts heighten the displacement risk for tenants and increase vacancies and loss of rent payments for landlords. And going forward, it's really important for there to be communication and flexible housing opportunities to support tenants and to support a tenant's stability and also a landlord's continuity in their business. It's important for landlord and tenants to work together. Next, we're going to talk about some local implementation and preferences. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the San Diego Housing Commission, and that's because of the 6 jurisdictions, 6 public housing authorities. They're one of the ones that has kind of so far made public what their contingency plan is for EHV households. And so for the San Diego Housing Commission, to minimize the impact of the loss of EHV, the San Diego Housing Commission will prioritize EHV families on their Section 8 project-based waitlist. The project-based voucher waitlist is just a different type of federal subsidy that provides housing assistance to the very similar households and vulnerable populations. The main difference between an EHV and a PBV voucher is that project-based vouchers is subsidies tied specifically to a unit, to a property, and is not portable if the tenant moves out of that assisted property. And versus EHVs are more flexible and similar to your traditional housing choice vouchers, where you're able to, with that voucher as a tenant, find your own housing within the jurisdiction you live in. For example, if you have a voucher with the city of San Diego, you can find your own a rental in the city of San Diego jurisdiction where you could then find a unit to rent, and that subsidy is portable. So that's one of the big differences. But it's important that even though PBV offers less flexibility, it still provides about the same level of assistance where both of these households are traditionally paying about 30% of their gross monthly income towards rent. So the housing costs would be comparable across both these programs, although you would lose the flexibility of being able to move to various units that the EHV voucher offers. Um, so specifically for this preference by the San Diego Housing Commission is, and it only applies to EHV vouchers issued by the San Diego Housing Commission. Um, San Diego City residents who had their EHV vouchers issued by another housing authority, then ported into the city and moved into the city, are excluded from this preference. Um, if you're one of these households, the public housing authority where you originated might have a different preference or different policy regarding the wind down. So I would recommend you reach out to that housing authority to find out how they're planning on winding down these EHV vouchers. Um, so first, to get this preference, it's not automatic. Tenants must apply online um, at the waitlist.sdhc.org website. So that's step one. And then next, they have to either call into the San Diego Housing Commission at 619-578-7717 or email at ehv at San Diego Housing Commission, sorry, ehv at sdhc.org to confirm the preference in the lottery. I would probably recommend of emailing or calling. Emailing, that way you have proof that you've made taken that second step after completing the app, after applying for the PBV preference. Um, and so that's one important step you want to take. And then, obviously you can call, but email again gives you that proof that you've taken that second step to complete the application process. PBV units are limited and are going to be allocated through a lottery system. And so I want to emphasize the importance of EHV households to apply timely, as soon as possible, because there's likely not going to be enough PBV units to rehouse the about 500 EHV households in that the San Diego Housing Commission administers. And so it's really important that you apply as soon as possible, get on that wait list, because if you wait, you might not, by the time you apply, you might not either there might not be enough PBV units left, or you might be lower on the potential preference list. Also, the other reason is this lottery is being conducted on a rolling basis from now until when the EHV funding ends. And so theoretically, right, like if you enter the lottery now and new units become available a month from now, you might be selected. You're able to be selected at that next drawing. Versus if you wait, then you won't be eligible for a drawing that you're not a part of. Now, just a little bit on kind of the other housing authorities in San Diego County. Like I mentioned, the San Diego Housing Commission administers about 500 EHV vouchers citywide. The next largest is the Housing Authority of the County of San Diego. They oversee about 200 EHV vouchers. Um, the Housing Authority of the County of San Diego plans to convert their EHV vouchers to that traditional Section 8 housing choice voucher if funding permits. They might be having updates to their administrative plan in the future, depending on funding levels, if they end up providing or adding different preferences. And then the remaining four public housing authorities in our county, National City, Encinitas, Oceanside, and Carlsbad, have not yet provided details on how they will be winding down their EHV households once they reach that funding cliff. Next, we're going to focus on some kind of tenant recommendations. First, right, like I mentioned, it's really important especially if you're within the San Diego Housing Commission jurisdiction, that you apply to the PBV waitlist as soon as possible, and then confirm that you've received the EHV preference with the San Diego Housing Commission. Um, And then for if you have any EHV vouchers, which one of the other 5 public housing authorities, like I mentioned, the county, National City, Carlsbad, Encinitas, and Oceanside, you might just won't be keeping an eye on, or checking in with your housing authority to see what their plan is on winding down the EHV vouchers. I know that the San Diego Housing Commission also has been pretty proactive in sending out letters to landlords and tenants about the changes, about the end of EHV vouchers, and I believe the county has done so as well. I expect the other 4 housing authorities to also kind of follow in that in follow step and being able at least providing initial notices to tenants, EHV tenants and landlords about the program ending, and then probably, and they will be providing kind of more updates if they're making any changes to their administrative plan. So that's step one, right? Applying for housing assistance. Another thing to consider is having flexible lease terms, right? Consider staying month to month leases, trying to avoid lease renewals to maintain flexibility with the funding cliff approaching in fall 2026. For example, right, like if your lease renewal is if your lease is expiring in March 2026, you don't want to commit to another year that would take you through February of 2027 if you have an EHV voucher and the funding is ending sometime in the fall, right? Because otherwise you might be in a position where you are responsible for the full amount of rent after your EHV subsidy ends. You want to make sure you have that flexibility to to move or explore other housing options once your EHV vouchers and assistance ends if you can't afford the rent in your current home on your own. Also, additionally, like I mentioned, the San Diego Housing Commission EHV families um, should try to avoid lease renewals because that PBV lottery is occurring on a rolling basis from now through fall of 2026. So if your name is selected, a month from now, you want the flexibility to be able to move out and and move into that PBV unit that will provide long-term subsidized housing assistance versus staying with your EHV where there's going to be a funding cliff coming in fall of 2026. And then communicating these things to your landlord, like, right, I know that most lease renewals are almost automatic and most tenants might not have an option, but talking with your landlord and explaining why you would like to stay month to month and how it might benefit them, which we'll cover in the next couple of slides when we focus on kind of like best practices for landlords. Also, landlords should, at least with the Senate Housing Commission, have received similar letters about the EHV program ending. So they should be on notice of what is coming, what the changes are for this EHV program in the city of San Diego. Also, exploring other legal protections. For example, under fair housing law, tenants can make reasonable accommodations, specifically like 10 elderly or disabled tenants, to terminate their lease early without penalty. On the website you see here in the slide at Legal Aid Society San Diego, we have kind of more information about the CHV program, and we also have a template reasonable accommodation letter tenants could use if they need to do a lease termination of their current EHV tenancy to be able to move into a PBV unit. I also want to highlight that under Civil Code Section 1946.7, survivors of domestic violence have additional rights to terminate their lease early without penalty, um, and if it meets the requirements of the specific civil code. And then lastly, if you're having trouble navigating these things, or for example, like let's say you're selected from a PV unit that becomes available next month, and you're told you need to move out, you need to move into it in 30 days, and your landlord is not letting you terminate your lease, reaching out to Legal Aid Society San Diego to see what your rights are and what legal assistance we may be able to offer to help you terminate your current tenancy without penalty. Next, we're going to be kind of focusing on some best practices for landlords. Very similar to kind of we've already been discussing, maintaining transparent communication with your tenants about funding timelines and housing options, right? You want to keep that line of communication open. Also for landlords, right? Allowing lease termination flexibility, right? Allowing early lease termination without penalties, to avoid evictions, and just to maintain that trust between you and your tenant. Otherwise, like taking you back to the hypothetical when we're talking about tenants, right? Like, let's say that you renewed your lease in March 2026 for 1 year, and it's not going to end until February 2027, and then in July of 2026, your EHV tenant tells you, hey, I would like to terminate my lease early because I've been selected for this PBV unit. And as a landlord, sure, you could dig your heels and say no, or say I'm going to charge you an early lease termination. But ultimately, like, what if that tenant decides not to move? At some point, that EHV funding is going to end, and that tenant is likely not going to be able to afford to pay all your rent. So by not terminating someone, allowing someone to leave early without penalty, you might be you might be eventually, you know, um, stuck with the tenant who can't pay their rent, and which might force you to go through a costly eviction process where you have to hire an attorney, pay court costs, and then you're also missing out on that rent until that process is finalized. Versus if you agree to do an early lease termination, you could easily re-rent that unit to someone else in this kind of hyper competitive rental market. Vacancy rates so low, it's something you could easily do, and could be save you a lot of money in the long run versus forcing a tenant to stay that they can't afford the rent once that EHV assistance ends. Also, be very mindful of fair housing compliance. Under fair housing law, like we were just kind of speaking about with tenants, what their rights are is you as an under fair housing law as a landlord, you may have the obligation to allow a disabled tenant to terminate their tenancy without penalties. And if you wrongfully deny a reasonable accommodation under fair housing law that has merit, you might be susceptible to legal liability where that tenant might have a cause of action to sue you. And again, that could be a lot more costly in the long run. So it's important and be mindful of reasonable accommodations. Recommended you consult an attorney versus deny one, or take any action with on an issue of law that you don't have any experience in, and it's best to talk to whoever your attorney is that you usually communicate regarding your rental properties. And then one other thing to highlight is that EHV vouchers are protected under local and state source of income protections that prevent landlords from discriminating against EHV households. So, for example, let's say that the funding cliff is coming in fall of 2026. You preemptively evicting an EHV tenant because the funding is ending in fall 2026 is actually source of income discrimination, if because you're treating this tenant who has this state protected source of income, the EHV voucher, differently. And so that may also result in monetary and civil liability for source of income discrimination under fair housing law. Again, consult an attorney. There are a lot of variables here. Managing property is not a side hustle, it is a profession. And so you want to make sure that if you haven't hired a property management company, you're doing this on your own, that you need to speak with an attorney because you might not know all the obligations you have under fair housing law to your tenants. And then lastly, just want to highlight some other potential pitfalls I've seen landlords fall into is reminding you illegal lockouts of tenants is a criminal offense. It's a criminal misdemeanor. Tenants can contact law enforcement if this occurs. City attorney or the prosecutor can file criminal charges against landlords for illegal lockouts. And illegal lockouts include landlords who take actions such as changing the locks, removing tenants' property, shutting off utilities, using threats or violence, or otherwise interfering with tenants' rights, and essentially with the motivation of forcing the tenant out. Like, for example, let's say you have an EHV tenant whose funding has ended, and you're like, instead of going through the formal eviction process, I'm going to shut off the utilities, or I'm going to threaten them by saying I'm going to call ICE or things like that. Those are all discrimination and also can result in additional criminal liability under state law. So it's really important that landlords aren't trying to forcibly remove tenants either by force or by threats, because that will also make you liable under civil and criminal law. And then, as a reminder, landlords must also comply with any local, state, and federal requirements before terminating EHV households. Again, it's recommended you consult an attorney. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I just want to highlight that this information that you received today here is current through December 2nd, 2025. I also want to highlight that this presentation is funded in whole or in part by the San Diego Housing Commission Eviction Prevention Program that is funded by the City of San Diego to provide these types of education to the community. So thank you all for your time, and I hope this information was helpful.